Chapter 1. The Quiet Before. There are days in St. Mary Mead when the very air seems to hold its breath. A hush settled gently over hedgerow, cottage, and garden alike. On this particular afternoon that hush carried a faint sweetness, remnants of the recent village fair. St. Mary Mead's green was still littered with faded bunting, and the breeze carried both the sugary scent of toffee apples and the earthy freshness of damp, mown grass. For Miss Marple, it was an hour to be savoured. She sat contentedly in her modest, well-tended garden, needles clicking as she worked a soft blue wool into the beginnings of a cardigan for her newest grandniece. Her hat was perched at a practical angle, and she was surrounded by a border of nodding foxgloves and the quiet hum of bees. Every so often she paused, listening not just to the drone of the insects, but to the distant laughter of children and the clatter of a milkman's cart along the high street. All was right in the world. The spell broke with the sudden intrusion of a car's engine rumbling up the lane, a distinctly modern sound among the sleepy chorus of rural England. Miss Marple glanced up just as the horn sounded, sharp and cheerful, shattering the afternoon calm. A moment later, a brisk knock echoed from the front door. Without missing a beat, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and peered through the lace curtain. She recognized the shape of the vehicle outside, a gleaming, compact red motor car shining almost ostentatiously beneath the cloudy sky. She did not hurry. Instead, she rang for her maid, Edna, and nodded towards the hallway. "Would you be so kind as to see who it is, Edna?" she asked. Edna, as always, obliged, smoothing her apron as she went. There was a brief exchange at the threshold, a delighted exclamation, the creak of the door swinging wider, and then a voice rang out, high and spirited. "Aunt Jane, look at my new car." Miss Marple's lips curved in a fond smile. It was unmistakably Joyce, the daughter of her dear friend Ethel. Tall, fair-haired, and glowing with youthful pride, Joyce strode in, keys dangling in her hand, her cheeks flushed from the drive. "My dear, how splendid!" Miss Marple rose, extending both hands in welcome. "Do come in and sit. Let me have a look at you. At me?" Joyce laughed as she flung herself onto the nearest chintz armchair, still breathless with excitement. "I thought I'd give you the honor of the first ride, Aunt Jane. She's a darling, really, and I simply couldn't wait to show her off." Miss Marple lowered herself into her favorite chair with a gentle sigh. "Cars were always your delight, even when you were quite small. I remember you refusing to play with anything else in the nursery except those dreadful tin motor cars that made such a racket." Joyce grinned, unashamed. "Absolutely true. And at school, too. Do you remember? Mother was forever talking about cars. Once she brought Father's car for the fete and we all went joy-riding. She managed to reverse it straight into the headmaster's wall. I don't think I've ever laughed so much." "Those were wonderful days," Miss Marple said, the memory bringing a glimmer of amusement to her pale blue eyes. "But your mother was never much of a driver, if truth be told." Joyce leaned forward, eyes bright with mischief. "All the more reason you should trust me to take you out, Aunt Jane. I promise I'm a much steadier hand." Miss Marple demurred, waving her hand gently. "Oh, at my age, one is rather better suited to armchairs and rose gardens, my dear." But Joyce was persistent, as the young often are. "Nonsense. It's a beautiful afternoon. We'll just pop round to the cafe for tea. I promise I'll drive like a nun on her way to evensong." It was hard to refuse Joyce, especially when her energy filled the little cottage like a warm gust of wind. Miss Marple, with a resigned smile, relented. "Very well, if only to please you." Edna brought their hats and handbags, and within minutes Miss Marple found herself carefully ensconced in the new car's front seat. The interior smelt faintly of leather and newness, and Joyce was full of explanations about horsepower, fuel economy, and the superior merits of her chosen model. They trundled through the village lanes, passing gardens still decorated from the fair, and came at last to the small cafe by the river. Tea was served with Victoria sponge cake, and Joyce chatted on about her job in town, Ethel's latest charity schemes, and the recent goings-on among the younger villagers. Miss Marple listened with that quiet attentiveness that made her a favourite among the youth of St. Mary Mead. She asked a question here and there, smiling at the right moments, collecting small facts like a bird gathers twigs for its nest. When the sky began to turn a soft silvery grey, caught between the fading heat of day and the threat of rain, Joyce reluctantly suggested they make their way home. The car rolled quietly through the narrowing lanes, the cottages now glowing in the gentle dusk. As they neared the old village post office, a squat brick building with faded blue paint, Miss Marple noticed a peculiar stillness. The world seemed to pause, suspended between one moment and the next. Suddenly, out of the gathering mist, a figure darted onto the road. Joyce gasped, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. Instinctively, she slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed, the car lurched to a halt, and before they could even process what had happened, a boy toppled forward, sprawling across the tarmac before them. For an instant, the world was utterly silent. The only sound was the anxious ticking of the car's engine and Joyce's sharp intake of breath. The boy lay motionless, limbs at awkward angles, blood seeping rapidly through his torn shirt. His face, pale, eyes wide with terror, was a mask of shock and confusion. Joyce recovered first. She flung open her door and stumbled towards the fallen boy, her heels clicking frantically against the wet road. Oh God, Aunt Jane, he's covered in blood. Someone, call for help. He's terribly hurt." Miss Marple did not panic. Instead, she opened her door with a gentle click, gathered her composure, and stepped into the cooling air. She approached with measured steps, observing not only the boy but the scene itself, the twisted bicycle half hidden in the grass verge, the single shoe lying a few feet away, the droplets of blood marking a trail back into the fog. The boy's shirt was torn open at the side, and blood dripped from a nasty gash across his ribs. His eyes flickered, searching their faces as though trying to place them, or perhaps searching for someone else entirely. There was a story there, Miss Marple thought, in the way he gripped the earth with his free hand, in the pain that tightened his jaw. A low murmur began behind them, the quiet of the village broken by approaching footsteps and hushed, worried voices. Neighbors emerged from their homes, Mrs. Price from the bakery, Mr. Weatherby from the greengrocer's, a pair of children clutching each other's hands. In moments, the lane was a flurry of concern. "Fetch Dr. Partridge," called Mrs. Price. "I'll telephone the police," said another. Someone produced a coat, laying it gently over the boy's shivering form. Joyce knelt, her hands shaking as she tried to reassure the boy. "You're all right now. Help is coming. Just stay with us." But Miss Marple's gaze lingered not on the blood, but on the peculiar set of the boy's jaw, the glint of something small and metallic gripped in his left hand, half hidden beneath his body. Above them, the mist thickened and the first drops of rain began to fall. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Mist. The arrival of the police in St. Mary Mead was an event in itself. Sirens did not wail, but the quiet authority of their approach was enough to draw neighbors to their windows, twitching curtains, betraying silent speculation. The village nurse, Miss Carrick, bustled in with her medical bag, her white coat flapping as she hurried across the lane to where Max Renner lay, sprawled beside Joyce's gleaming new car. She assessed the boy with brisk, competent hands, her voice calm and unflappable. "He's alive, but in shock. We must get him to the clinic," she pronounced, her words cutting through the anxious murmurs of the growing crowd. The constable, a steady sort with a sandy moustache and honest eyes, radioed for the stretcher. Together they carefully lifted the boy, still limp, face pale beneath streaks of dried blood, onto the waiting cot. Miss Carrick leaned over and gently asked, What's your name, dear?" For a moment, the boy's lips trembled. Then, almost inaudibly, he whispered, "Max. Max Renner." The name traveled swiftly among the villagers, causing a ripple of recognition. As the police prepared to leave, the constable turned to Joyce, whose hands were still shaking, as she stood by the car's open door. "May I see your license, miss?" Joyce flushed crimson. I haven't got one yet. I was just showing Aunt Jane the car. I didn't mean—" The constable frowned, glancing from Joyce's stricken face to Miss Marple, who stood quietly nearby. There was something about Miss Marple's presence, her gentle composure, the unwavering calm in her eyes, that seemed to reassure him. He lowered his voice. "We'll let you off with a warning this time, miss. Please be careful." Joyce managed a shaky nod. "Thank you, officer." But the incident had rattled her. She clung to Miss Marple's arm, her earlier confidence gone. "Oh, Aunt Jane, what if he had died? I'll never forgive myself for not having a license." Miss Marple patted her hand. There, my dear. None of this is your fault. But perhaps it's best if we leave the car at home for a while, don't you think?" As the police and nurse disappeared down the lane with Max, the villagers slowly dispersed. Gossip buzzed on doorsteps. Miss Marple, however, remained oddly silent. Beneath her customary serenity, her mind was working busily, turning over the curious facts that had begun to emerge. She remembered the name, Renner. It rang a bell in her extensive catalogue of village knowledge. Ethan Renner, she recalled, was Max's uncle. Ethan was a man of few words and fewer friends, tall, thin, and almost forbidding in his austerity. He lived at the edge of the village in a weather-beaten house surrounded by brambles. The local children sometimes dared each other to touch his front gate, and he was seen only at council meetings, funerals, and, rarely, at the post office to collect his mail. Miss Marple also recalled that Ethan's family had known more than their share of tragedy. Max's mother had died suddenly 2 years ago, leaving the boy adrift. Since then, rumor had it that Max had become increasingly withdrawn. And now here he was, bleeding and barely conscious, uttering strange, fragmented words. That evening, the sky pressed low over St. Mary Mead, heavy with mist and the first chill of autumn. In the window of Dr. Bell's small, tidy clinic, a dim light burned late into the night. Miss Marple sat in the waiting room, her hands folded quietly in her lap, while Joyce stared at the floor beside her, eyes red-rimmed from worry and shock. At 10:30, Dr. Bell emerged from the consulting room, his face grave, behind steel-rimmed spectacles. "Well, Miss Marple," he said softly, "your young friend is alive. That's the good news. But I must say I'm deeply concerned." Joyce looked up anxiously. Will he recover?" "He's stable, but it's serious. His blood work shows he's ingested a heavy dose of some sort of narcotic. We're running more tests. There are also older bruises and cuts, not all of them from the accident. What's most remarkable, though, is that the blood on his clothes isn't all his. Forensics confirms there are traces of at least 2 other people." Joyce gasped, covering her mouth. "But how? What happened?" Dr. Bell shook his head. "He's been barely conscious. When he does speak, he only repeats the same words. Farmhouse, red car, and music, over and over, as if trapped in some waking nightmare." Miss Marple inclined her head, as if committing every detail to memory. "How long before he's able to answer questions, doctor?" "It's hard to say. If the drugs wear off safely, perhaps in the morning." Miss Marple nodded, thanked the doctor, and ushered a subdued Joyce out into the night. Word spread quickly, as it always did in St. Mary Mead. That night the police paid a visit to the Renner house, a brooding structure half shrouded by creeping ivy. Miss Marple, walking home past the house on her usual evening round, paused to watch the flash of torchlight in the windows. Inside, Max's father Alexander and Uncle Ethan stood, stiff and worried. Ethan Renner's face was set in a deep frown, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness and anxiety. The police sergeant questioned them gently, but firmly. Ethan's voice, when it came, was clipped and tired. Max has not been himself for some time. He stopped talking to anyone, locked himself away with books or his records. He was terribly close to his mother. After her death, he changed. I thought it might do him good to be around other young people, hence the retreat. Fresh air, music, camaraderie, a chance to heal. Instead, this. Alexander, an anxious man with thinning hair and wrinkled hands, spoke quietly. We hardly knew what to do with him. He would vanish for hours, sometimes days. When Ethan suggested the retreat, I hoped it would bring him back to himself. But he came home quieter than ever. And now? The sergeant nodded, making notes. Did Max have any enemies? Anyone who might wish him harm? Ethan shook his head. Not that I know of. He was a gentle boy, sensitive, too sensitive, perhaps. The interview ended without answers. Outside, the mist had thickened, swirling in the yellow beam of the porch light. Miss Marple watched the police depart, then resumed her walk, her mind already retracing the events of the day. Back in her neat sitting room, Miss Marple settled into her chair with a cup of chamomile tea. The house was quiet, save for the tick of the clock and the distant hoot of an owl. She took out her notebook, a habit learned over a lifetime of noticing, and began to jot down what she had learned. A boy found bleeding in the lane. His own blood and the blood of 2 others. Heavy drugs in his system. The repeated words, farmhouse, red car, music, and most chilling of all, the mention of 2 missing children, rumors that had only begun to circulate since the fair. Miss Marple's thoughts moved swiftly, calmly, piecing together fragments. She recalled seeing a red car, a different one, older and less well kept, parked near the edge of the common during the fair. She remembered faint music drifting over the hedgerows late at night, long after most villagers had gone home, and she remembered, with a pang, the anxious face of Mrs. Willoughby, whose little twin girls had not been seen since the festivities. Was there a connection, or was it simply coincidence, the way tragedies sometimes clustered like storm clouds? At midnight, the village was hushed, the only sounds the drip of rain from the eaves and the gentle hiss of mist against the windows. Miss Marple watched from her bedroom as the last police car rolled away from the Renner house, its headlights swallowed by fog. She pondered Max's muttered words. Farmhouse, red car, music. The images played in her mind, a boy falling in the road, crimson stains on his shirt, the echo of a tune half remembered, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, the shadow of 2 missing children. Miss Marple smiled to herself, just a little, for she knew, as only she could, that when one piece of a puzzle revealed itself, the others would soon follow, as surely as dawn follows even the blackest night. Chapter 3. Whispers and Warnings. Dawn came reluctantly to St. Mary Mead, the sky pale and cloud-streaked, as if the sun itself hesitated to shine on a village so weighted by rumor. There was a strangeness to the air, too still for May, and faintly sour like something left unsaid. Even the birdsong seemed tentative, as though the finches and robins had picked up on the unease that simmered beneath the surface of village life. Miss Marple awoke earlier than usual, a habit born from years of keen observation. She spent a quiet moment looking over the garden from her bedroom window. The hollyhocks bowed under dew, the roses unopened, the hedge unusually silent. She washed and dressed with her customary precision, selected her favorite blue cardigan, and fetched her shopping basket from its hook in the hallway. Before stepping out, she paused at her writing desk. There she opened her slim, blue-bound diary and carefully jotted a few thoughts from the night before, details that to most would seem trivial but to Jane Marple could someday prove essential. A name, a snatch of overheard dialogue, the glint of something metallic in the grass by the post office. She closed the diary and set off into the uncertain morning. As she made her way down the lane, Miss Marple noted the subtle choreography of suspicion. Curtains twitched as she passed. Voices fell silent, then rose again in whispers when she was out of earshot. She greeted Mrs. Price, who was rearranging the day's loaves in the bakery window, and nodded at young Tommy Cresswell, whose bicycle seemed almost as jittery as its rider. It was outside the post office that the heart of the gossip throbbed. 4 or 5 villagers stood in a loose semicircle, clutching their shopping bags and murmuring urgently. Old Mr. Pettigrew shook his head, saying, "Never seen the like, not since the war." Mrs. Willoughby dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, her twin boy's absence a raw wound in the morning hush. Miss Marple offered gentle, measured greetings and slipped by, her ears alert for the smallest detail. She caught fragments. "He'd blood in the grass." "That poor boy, Max." "It's something happened at the farmhouse. A little further on, outside the village clinic." Miss Marple paused as she saw the local constable, Constable Read, speaking in hushed tones to a young man with a notepad, the junior reporter from the local newspaper. Read's words, meant to be private, drifted out into the morning air. Max Renner had gone to a youth retreat at the old farmhouse, the one closed since last winter. Something happened there. Miss Marple, careful to appear as if she hadn't heard, merely nodded her head and walked on, her mind sharpening. A brief check of the previous night's police files relayed through the friendly postmistress, who had an eye for useful gossip, revealed more details. The farmhouse, long a place of stories and secrets, had been reopened recently for a rehabilitation program, a small, well-meaning charity retreat aimed at local youths struggling with loneliness, anxiety, or, as some put it, the troubles. The retreat was organized and led by Professor Neera, head of the village sanatorium, and a person respected but regarded as distant, even odd, by some villagers. Several local children, including Max, had attended. But now 2 of those children were missing, and worry hung like a pall. It was nearly midday when Inspector Craddock, a thoughtful man with greying hair and a talent for listening, arrived from county headquarters. He took charge quietly, ordering the farmhouse and its grounds cordoned off with yellow police tape. A forensics team set to work, combing through each room and every patch of grass for answers. Miss Marple, standing just outside the cordon, took in the scene. The farmhouse was an old, weather-beaten structure, sloping roof, boarded windows, overgrown with nettles and wild thyme. It looked as if it had been waiting all winter for this very drama to unfold. At the rear, behind the bar that had once served cider to farmhands, the forensics team called out. Bloodstains marked the lawn, smeared in long streaks, as if someone had been dragged toward the copse of trees at the boundary. Constable Read, his face pale, murmured, "It looks like someone tried to hide a struggle." Inside, the farmhouse revealed more secrets. The kitchen was cluttered and cold, the stove topped with an ancient blackened kettle that seemed to whisper of interrupted meals and late-night vigils. In the living area, torn blankets and cushions were heaped carelessly, as if a storm, or something worse, had passed through. On the floor, beside a half-spilled tin of cocoa, sat a broken record player, its lid hanging by one hinge. The record still inside was scratched and warped, playing just a snatch of melody before skipping again and again. the accompanying tape recorder whirred, replaying a strange, unfamiliar tune on a loop. Inspector Craddock bent over it, his brow furrowed. "This song sounds rather odd," he muttered, and switched it off, the music lingering like a half-remembered dream. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed in recognition. She had heard that music before, faintly, as she passed Mrs. Hargreaves's garden on a windy evening, or drifting through the village square when someone's window was open. There was a certain rhythm to it, like Chinese folk music, yet tinged with a hypnotic, lulling quality. It was the sort of music that made one uneasy without ever knowing why. As the search continued, Miss Marple quietly approached Professor Nearer, who stood at the edge of the scene, arms crossed tightly. The professor's face was drawn, and she answered questions in clipped, clinical tones. "It was meant to help," she said. "To provide support, routine, and community. We had 8 children at the retreat, aged 15 to 18. Max was one. The missing boys, Ollie and Daniel, were from neighboring towns." Miss Marple asked. "Did you notice anything unusual in the past week? Any quarrels, strangers near the farmhouse, odd behavior among the staff?" Professor Nearer hesitated. Max became withdrawn the last 2 days. He spoke of hearing music at night, seeing a red car parked near the trees. We thought perhaps he was overtired. There was an incident on Friday, a row between the boys, but nothing more. And then she trailed off, unable or unwilling to say more. By late afternoon, the search had grown tense. Dogs were brought in, combing the nearby woods. Parents waited, white-faced at the gates. No sign of the missing boys. As dusk fell, the sky deepened to violet. Back at the clinic, Max regained consciousness for the first time since his collapse. His face was thin, eyes haunted. The doctor, stern but kind, warned, "Just a few questions, please." Max struggled to sit up, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept repeating the same broken phrases: a red car, the farmhouse. There was music playing. Then everything went dark. Inspector Craddock, standing at the foot of the bed, looked frustrated. "This boy can't seem to make sense of anything. He's not explaining clearly what happened." Miss Marple watched Max closely. She noted the tremor in his hands, the darting of his eyes, the way he gripped the blanket as if anchoring himself to reality. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. "Sometimes, when people cannot speak, the truth hides in their faces, their clothes, or in the sounds they make." Inspector Craddock gave her a skeptical glance, but Miss Marple only smiled, her gaze never leaving Max. That night, St. Mary Mead was quieter than usual. A cold wind rattled the windows as Miss Marple sat at her desk, diary open beneath the glow of a single lamp. She wrote only 2 lines. 2 missing boys. A piece of music, where pain was hidden. She paused, pen poised, listening to the silence. She knew this was only the beginning. The threads of the mystery had only just started to show themselves. And in the darkness, somewhere beyond the reach of the village lights, answers were waiting to be found. Chapter 4. Shadows and Silences. The third morning dawned over St. Mary Mead with a hush more profound than any before. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. There was neither the sweet scent of the fair in the air, nor the cheerful echoes of laughter from the lanes. Instead, a sense of watchfulness, almost fear, had wrapped itself around the village like mist. Housewives moved quietly through their morning routines, children played indoors, and the faces of the men in the square were grave, set in lines that spoke of sleepless nights and troubled thoughts. Miss Marple felt this shift keenly as she sat at her breakfast table, the ticking of the clock louder than usual, the chink of her spoon in the teacup strangely sharp. She ate quietly, her mind already busy with thoughts far from her porridge and toast. The whole village was unsettled by Max Renner, by the disappearance of the two boys, and by that odd cassette whose tune had somehow threaded itself into everyone's dreams. After clearing away her plate and laying out a saucer of cream for her neighbor's cat, who had taken to visiting each morning, Miss Marple donned her old gardening gloves and slipped into the little patch behind her cottage. The morning air was cool, the pansies still jeweled with dew. As she tidied the leaves, she let the radio play softly in the background, tuning in to the comforting voices of the announcers. They too seemed subdued, their chat more tentative, as though even the wireless could sense the village's worry. Finishing her garden work, Miss Marple dusted off her skirt and prepared for her daily errands. She had a few letters to post, and truth be told, a gentle hope that the walk would allow her to gauge the mood of the village more closely. With her shopping basket on her arm and her diary tucked discreetly beneath her shawl, she set out towards the post office. On the way, she exchanged subdued greetings with those she met. Mrs. Weatherby, who normally stopped for a cheerful word, simply nodded and hurried by, her face drawn. At the bakery, the usual morning queue was shorter, and even the shop bell seemed to ring more softly, as if it too respected the anxiety that gripped St. Mary Mead. When Miss Marple reached the post office, she noticed immediately that something was amiss. Marlene, the young assistant, usually full of nervous chatter and quick smiles, looked almost spectral behind the counter. Her complexion, always pale, now verged on grey, and there were dark circles beneath her eyes. Miss Marple stepped forward, producing her letters and a gentle smile. "Good morning, Marlene. You look as though you've had a sleepless night." Marlene avoided her gaze, her hands fumbling with the stamps. Miss Marple watched her for a moment, then spoke softly. "My dear, if someone asked you for something and you didn't understand what it was, that doesn't make you to blame." For a moment, Marlene's composure wavered. She bit her lip, tears threatening. In a trembling voice, she confessed, "Ma'am, I was the one who ordered the cassette. Professor Neera told me it was special music for relaxation, but when I listened to it, it wasn't like normal music at all. It was strange. It made me feel restless, almost frightened." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "Has anyone else heard that music before?" she asked gently. Marlene hesitated, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Maybe Neera, ma'am, had played it before. Once I heard the same music coming from her garden when I delivered her post. She looked quite anxious at the time." Miss Marple filed this away, noting the detail with the same care she used when cataloguing clues in her garden. She thanked Marlene, offered a few words of comfort, and stepped back out into the street. The day wore on, thick with speculation. Snatches of overheard conversation clung to the air like the morning fog. At the grocer's, Mrs. Lemley insisted the whole thing must be Max's imagination. These boys these days with their strange ideas and fancies. In the square, Mr. Pettigrew darkly muttered about things better left undisturbed. But it was the music, that peculiar, foreign-sounding tune, that seemed to unsettle people most. Some villagers swore it gave them headaches, others that it made them dream uneasy dreams. By noon, the whole village seemed restless and fidgety. Children peered from behind curtains, forbidden to roam too far. Elderly ladies sat together over tepid tea, voices dropping to whispers when anyone mentioned the farmhouse or Professor Neera. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock arrived at the clinic, bringing with him a file of recorded statements from the parents of the missing boys. He found Miss Marple in the waiting room, leafing quietly through a gardening magazine. "Miss Marple," he said, I thought you might be interested in these." He handed over the file, his manner more respectful than usual. Miss Marple accepted it, scanning the first few lines with a practiced eye. The parents' words were full of anxiety, hope, and, especially, confusion. One mother mentioned a red car parked near the farmhouse late at night. Another said her son had spoken about a funny song that made him feel floaty. More than one parent mentioned Professor Neera, her strict rules, her careful control over what music was played in the house. Craddock watched Miss Marple as she read. "Do you think there's more to this music than relaxation?" he asked. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, as if listening for a note only she could hear. "Music can soothe, but it can also cloud the mind. I don't think this was meant just to relax. It was meant to suppress, to hide." Craddock's brow furrowed. "You mean—" She shook her head. "I don't know, not yet. But something about that cassette makes me uneasy." That evening, the mood in the village square was tense. People gathered in small clusters, glancing nervously at the police cordon near the church. Some whispered that the police would soon question Professor Neera more closely. Others dismissed it as all just Max's confusion, perhaps brought on by stress or by drugs. The square, usually a place of laughter and gossip, now echoed with uncertainty. Miss Marple wandered among them, listening, watching. She spoke little, but her eyes missed nothing. The pattern was becoming clear to her, even if she could not yet see the full picture. Later, at home, Miss Marple sat by her window, diary open in her lap, the pen poised above a fresh page. The room was quiet, but for the occasional tick of the mantel clock and the distant rumble of a lorry on the main road. She wrote, "A retreat, a red car, a sound that drowns out everything, and 3 people, of whom 2 are still missing." Then, after a long moment of thought, she added, "The question isn't that Max was there. The question is, who else was?" She closed the diary, her heart beating a little faster. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the pansies against the glass. The case was shifting, the darkness gathering in new corners. But Miss Marple was not afraid. She had faced shadows before, and she knew that sometimes when the village was at its most silent, the truth was just beginning to speak. Chapter 5. The Secrets Behind the Wall. Dusk descended early over St. Mary Mead, as if the village wished to draw the curtains on a day that had held too many questions and far too few answers. The air was thick with dampness, carrying the heavy scent of earth and wet leaves. Windows glimmered with early lamplight. In some houses, radios played quietly, broadcasting distant laughter or somber violin notes. But here and there, you might notice, if you were Jane Marple, a household a little too quiet, as if it, too, was holding its breath. Miss Marple wrapped herself in a woolen shawl, its familiar weight bringing a modicum of comfort, and settled into her drawing-room. Her diary was open on the table, a page waiting for fresh entries. Until now, she had confined herself to observation and gentle questions, knitting together stray remarks, faces in windows, and the tone of voices as people recounted what little they knew. But she sensed that the village was moving past whispers. Now, action was needed. Her own curiosity, always a companion, never an enemy, pressed her to step beyond her garden gate and look a little harder. It was, as she was finishing her cup of tea, that the telephone rang, a sound brisk and out of place in the quiet evening. On the other end was Inspector Craddock, his tone measured but insistent. "Miss Marple, we're planning a second inspection of the rehab center, the old farmhouse. Would you care to join us? Your perspective has been helpful." She allowed herself a thin, almost mischievous smile and replied, "You never see anything unless you actually look, Inspector." "I shall join you." They met outside the rehab just as the light was dying. The farmhouse was a somber shape on the edge of the village, its windows dark and unwelcoming, the door creaking slightly as it opened. Two uniformed officers waited at the entrance, and the hall was filled with the faint smell of antiseptic and something less pleasant, a sourness that lingered even after several days had passed. Inside, Craddock led the way, torch in hand. Miss Marple, moving quietly behind him, felt the chill deepen as they passed through narrow corridors. The rooms were mostly bare now, save for a few chairs, a battered table, and some educational posters curling at the corners. "We'll begin in the storeroom," Craddock said. "It's where all the medication and supplies are kept." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes already sweeping the area. The storeroom was cold, almost icy, and lined with shelves stacked with bottles and boxes, all arranged with rigid order. Nothing seemed out of place, at least not at first. Yet Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a massive wooden cabinet pressed against the far wall. Unlike the metal shelves, the cabinet looked ancient, its wood darkened by decades of use and perhaps secrets. It was the sort of piece one rarely moved, and therefore an excellent place to conceal something one did not wish found. Bending, she retrieved a small cleaning brush someone had dropped beneath the lower shelf. With slow, deliberate strokes, she ran it across the back of the cabinet, brushing away dust and crumbs. As she worked, she felt a subtle dip in the wall, a section that echoed slightly beneath her knuckles. Inspector Craddock, noticing her curiosity, asked, "What are you looking for?" She glanced at him over her glasses. "Sometimes, Inspector, the most important things are the ones you can't see at all. Hidden things have a way of making themselves known to those who are patient." With some effort and the help of a sturdy attendant, the cabinet was eased forward. Behind it, a thin crack in the plaster was revealed. When the wall was pressed, a piece of panel gave way, and a small cavity was discovered. It was expertly constructed, almost invisible to the casual eye. Inside were several sealed packets wrapped in waxed paper and old string, worn and faded, as though they'd been stashed in haste by someone nervous, desperate, or both. Inspector Craddock, now alert, drew on a pair of gloves and carefully slit one packet open. Out spilled small capsules, off-white, perfectly uniform and, according to the label on one packet, manufactured by a foreign pharmaceutical firm. Craddock exhaled slowly. "Synthetic drugs. This matches the substance found in Max Renner's blood. These are powerful, illegal, and lethal in the wrong hands." Miss Marple stayed silent, watching the pale light glimmer on the plastic. She caught a whiff of something sweet and sharp, like burnt varnish or caramelized sugar, a smell she recognized from Max's clothing, and again just now as the wall opened. She also noted with a practiced eye several old nail marks at the edge of the cavity, as if someone had repeatedly pried the panel loose and then secured it again. Craddock straightened, brow furrowed. All of this was hidden in Professor Neera's domain. Perhaps she's responsible. She's the authority here. Miss Marple tilted her head, her face unreadable. "Perhaps," she said softly, but her mind remained open. At that moment, a faint rustle in the hallway announced another arrival. Dr. Neera herself entered, her pale face drawn and pinched, dark shadows smudging the skin beneath her eyes. Her white coat hung loosely from her thin frame, and her hands were covered in latex gloves. She spoke quickly, her voice thin with anxiety. "I don't buy the medicines, Inspector. That's Joyce and Henry's job. I only supervise the program, approve the schedules, and handle the reports. Both Joyce and Henry are on leave. I had no reason to access that storeroom lately." Her words were defensively precise, yet her eyes flickered with a kind of hunted weariness. Miss Marple watched her with quiet intensity. There was something in Dr. Neera's posture, a reluctance, perhaps, or the heaviness of someone bearing secrets not entirely her own. As Dr. Neera gestured toward the packets, Miss Marple's sharp gaze caught an odd detail, a tiny burn mark, dark and round, on the left glove, precisely where one might hold a cigarette for a hurried, secretive smoke. The smell she'd noticed before was there, faint but definite. It was a scent she now linked to hidden things, scorched, sweet, chemical. No one else seemed to notice, but for Miss Marple, such small marks were rarely accidental. She committed the sight to memory, letting her face remain politely blank. Inspector Craddock pressed further, but Dr. Neera's responses grew less certain. She insisted she was being framed, or that there had been a mistake. Her hands trembled as she spoke. Miss Marple offered no judgment. She simply watched the interaction, noting how fear had replaced the confidence in Neera's eyes. Was it guilt, or something darker, the fear of what others might do if the truth came out? At last, the search concluded. Craddock took possession of the drugs, locking them in a secure evidence bag. The cavity in the wall was closed again, but the air in the room seemed heavier, full of words unsaid and threats unspoken. On their way out, Miss Marple lingered for a moment, glancing once more at the old cabinet. The wall now looked solid and innocent, but she knew better than to trust appearances. Sometimes secrets hid not in the darkness itself, but in the silence that followed discovery. That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her window as the last light faded. She opened her diary and wrote, in her careful hand, "Burn mark on glove. Same smell as before. Drugs found behind the shelf. Only fear in Neera's eyes." She paused, then added a final, chilling thought. Not just drugs hidden behind the wall, there were voices too. Every secret leaves an echo waiting for someone to listen. As she closed her diary, the wind rattled the garden gate, and a fox barked in the distance. Miss Marple knew the case was moving toward a revelation, but not yet. The village had not yet surrendered its deepest shadows. Still, with every day, the silence was thinning, and behind it, the truth was stirring, restless at last. Chapter 6. The Perfect Lie. The morning dawned as if it had nothing to hide. The sky, swept in a vivid, impossible blue, every detail on the hedgerows and lawns newly etched by the sun. Yet to Miss Marple, the clear day felt almost mocking, like the too clean smile of a practiced liar. She sat at her breakfast table, hands folded, her plate untouched, thoughts turning over and over like a skein of wool, waiting for a dropped stitch. The previous evening's discoveries haunted her. The secret cavity behind the storeroom wall, the bitter, sweet scent of burnt varnish and cloves, the tiny burn mark on Professor Neera's glove. Each detail was an unfinished phrase, a puzzle piece forced into the wrong place. She was still mulling these things when the gentle, urgent knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her maid appeared, her face pale with news. Professor Neera had been found dead, the door locked from the inside, breakfast untouched, her body collapsed on the floor by the bed. The news swept through the village like a gust of wind, slamming every door. Whispers moved faster than truth. She couldn't live with her guilt. It was all too much. The drugs, faster than truth. She couldn't live with her guilt. It was all too much. The drugs, the missing boys. By noon, the headlines blared what the villagers had already decided to believe. Professor Neera takes her own life under the weight of guilt. Yet, as Miss Marple listened to the town's murmur, watched faces ease and brows unknit, she felt only a deepening unease. The ending had come too soon, too conveniently. All the threads, supposedly, had been tied. Why then did the knot seem so hollow? She resolved to visit the sanatorium, offering condolences as her excuse, though her true intention was to observe, to feel, and to sense. There is a particular silence, Miss Marple knew, that follows sudden relief. It is not peace, it is denial, like children hiding behind their own hands. The staff greeted her with a mixture of deference and relief. They were eager, she thought, for this story to be over, hungry for calm and frightened of ghosts. The door to Neera's room was still sealed, but after a few words about her age and community respect, Miss Marple was quietly admitted. The room was a study, in order. The bed was neatly made, a woolen throw folded at the foot, the curtain partially drawn to admit a pale slant of morning sun. On the bedside table sat a half-filled cup of tea, cold now, its steam long gone. There was, at first glance, nothing amiss, but Miss Marple had never believed in first glances. She began, as always, by standing quietly, breathing the air. Instantly she detected it, the faint, clinging odor of burnt cloves and chemical varnish, like a memory hiding beneath lavender polish. It was the same scent she had noticed in the storeroom and again, fainter, wilder, at the Renner garden. She let her eyes travel the room, noting the order, the almost deliberate neatness, the sense of something staged. She noticed the curtain first. Just beneath the window the hem was darkened, a faint scorch mark, as though the tip of a cigarette had idled too long against the fabric. It was small, easy to overlook, but in such a meticulous room it was a flaw too deliberate to be accidental. Miss Marple moved to the bedside table. The teacup had a faint ring of lipstick, two overlapping marks, a deep red, almost violet. Neera, she remembered, never wore lipstick. She had always been conscious of her professional appearance, plain and restrained, her face bare, save for the tiniest dab of powder. Why then this stain? And why two prints overlapping, as if the cup had been shared, or pressed, to trembling lips more than once? She scanned the tabletop for Neera's diary, which had always lain there. It was missing. Only a burnt cover remained, curled and blackened, on the floor near the bed, a silent testimony that someone, recently and with haste, had sought to destroy its contents. As Miss Marple lingered in the room, she imagined the scene as the nurse might have found it, the untouched breakfast tray, the door locked from within, the body on the floor, the note carefully folded and placed by the bed. Too carefully. People in despair rarely think to tidy up after themselves. They do not fold notes, nor clean cups, nor close curtains with precision. Despair is messy, and guilt even more so. She looked at the note again, now in the inspector's evidence bag. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, composed. "Forgive me. I never wanted to do any of this, but everything has slipped beyond my control now. Max's mother, his friends, the music, the drugs, it was all my responsibility. Please forgive me, this is my last breath." Inspector Craddock had closed the file with satisfaction. This is a clear confession, case practically closed. But Miss Marple's mind whispered other possibilities. She replayed her last encounter with Neera, her voice brittle, her eyes darting, the gloves on her hands concealing something more than nervousness. She remembered the way the room now smelt, the scorch on the curtain, the missing diary, the lipstick marks, tiny incongruities that together formed a silent shout. She asked the housekeeper, in an offhand way, who had last seen Neera. She was in her office late, came the reply. Joyce came by to deliver some papers. Henry was away. Then Dr. Neera said she'd go to her room and rest. And her mood? Strange, distracted. She said she felt threatened, that perhaps it was time to tell the police everything. She seemed afraid. Miss Marple nodded. She asked about the room key. The staff confirmed that it was found in the inside lock, the only other key still in the main office. The staff had forced the door after no answer to repeated knocks. After a last look, Miss Marple left the room, pausing at the scorched corner of the curtain. Out in the hallway, she stood a moment, letting the echoes of Neera's life settle. The scent of burnt cloves seemed to follow her down the corridor. She returned home as the blue sky faded to evening. The village seemed to breathe easier, unaware of what it had chosen not to see. Miss Marple entered her drawing room and opened her diary to a fresh page. She wrote, "When everything appears clear, something is probably being hidden. False confession, burn mark, smell, missing diary." She sat for a moment, pen poised, recalling the tiredness in Neera's eyes, the fear in her voice, the odd, too perfect arrangement of the scene. It all pointed not to closure, but to a deeper mystery, a second story written between the lines of the first. Outside, the evening chill deepened. Villagers returned to their routines, content that the tragedy had resolved itself. But Miss Marple watched the shadows lengthen, certain that something vital was being overlooked. A hand behind the curtain, a voice in the dark, a truth dressed up in guilt and sorrow for others to swallow. She pressed her lips together, determined. "The real story," she whispered, "is only just beginning." The wind rattled the window panes as night descended, carrying secrets from one corner of St. Mary Mead to another. And somewhere, in that gathering darkness, the person who had truly orchestrated the tragedy was watching, waiting, for who knew what. Chapter 7. Ashes and Echoes. The sanatorium had grown cold and watchful since Professor Neera's death, as though the building itself recoiled from memory. The very walls, which once echoed with footsteps and the comforting drone of routine, now seemed to listen more than they spoke. Silence hovered in the hallways. Staff moved about with a wary hush, glancing over shoulders as if fearful that grief or guilt might materialize around the next corner. Patients sensed it too, speaking less, retreating into themselves, their eyes flitting toward closed doors or shadowed alcoves. The air itself held a restless energy, tinged with unease and unspoken questions. Miss Marple felt this change the moment she crossed the sanatorium threshold. She entered unnoticed, as only she could. Her slight figure and gentle manner rendered her almost invisible when she wished to observe. She drifted down the corridor, careful not to draw attention until she reached the storeroom. The police had sealed the door, a thick band of tape stamped with bold lettering across the frame, but it hardly mattered. Miss Marple had not come to search for more drugs. What she sought was memory, atmosphere, the remnants of a story that lingered even after the actors had departed. Even so, as she lingered near the storeroom, the familiar scent reached her, burning clove, sweet varnish, and something faintly chemical. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memory take hold. She had smelled it in the storeroom during the first search, again in Professor Neera's room after her death, and, she realized now, once in the garden of Ethan Renner's house. This was no coincidence. Wherever this story had left its mark, the scent lingered, a ghostly signature that told of secrets still unburied. Miss Marple bent down by the shelf, her movements so unobtrusive they barely disturbed the dust. With a steady hand, she collected a speck of residue from the floor, folding it into a tissue and slipping it quietly into her purse. To any observer, she might have seemed a fussy old lady fussing over a bit of dirt, but Miss Marple's eyes were keen and her purpose exact. She knew the importance of small things, the almost invisible evidence that could shout the loudest if only one listened. She straightened, brushing her hands against her skirt, and turned to leave. As she did, a shelf caught her attention, a coffee mug, familiar in its plainness, the same make as the one she'd seen in Neera's room. She moved closer, eyes narrowing. 2 lipstick marks adorned the rim, pale but distinct. Neera never wore lipstick, of that she was certain. She had always been fastidious about her appearance, favoring a stern, bare-faced look that matched her clinical approach to work and life. So whose marks were these? And why, too, when the rest of the staff rarely used that break room since the investigation had begun? Miss Marple did not touch the mug. Instead, she regarded it as one might a riddle. Its silence pressed upon her, demanding to be understood. For a moment, she wondered who had sat here, so close to the secrets now sealed behind police tape, who had spoken in whispers, or perhaps not at all, and left their mark on porcelain as a silent clue. On her way out, the cold air pressed against her cheeks and a memory surfaced, a fire that smoulders beneath ash, undetected until a gust of wind brings it back to life. In every shadow, every faded scent, every overlooked object, Miss Marple felt the pulse of something unfinished. She returned home as dusk was falling, the streets of St. Mary Mead dipped in purple light. The houses, set back from the road and bordered by untamed hedges, looked almost otherworldly in the gathering gloom. There was a sense, as she walked, that the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to surface. Inside her cottage, she found calming routine, her coat on the hook, shawl on the chair, kettle on the hob. Yet her mind churned with images and echoes, things said and unsaid, clues that would not be dismissed. Before tea, she opened her diary to a clean page and wrote in her neat, unwavering hand, "Evidence that is hidden often speaks the loudest. Not every ash holds a fire, but there is always a memory. And some memories never burn away, like Eleanor's name, still alive on the air." The light from the window faded as she worked, and soon only the soft lamp on her desk illuminated her writing. Miss Marple sat back, turning the pages of her diary to an old entry, the corner creased and worn. In spidery ink it read, "Eleanor, 3 years ago, missing." That name sounded in her mind like a bell from a distant church. 3 years ago, Eleanor, bright, promising, troubled Eleanor, had vanished, and the case had faded into that peculiar oblivion that small communities adopt for unresolved tragedies. But some losses do not recede. They grow sharper, more insistent, as new wounds are layered atop the old. A picture took shape before Miss Marple's eyes. Max's face, slicked with blood, his features contorted with fear and confusion. The missing boys, faces never seen but haunting every lane and conversation. Neera's lifeless form, the odd order of her room, the staged confession, and that strange, hypnotic music that had lulled a household and perhaps a village into silence and forgetting. With a steady hand, Miss Marple opened a small, lacquered box kept on her desk. Inside, she kept a few photographs, snapshots of old friends, mementos from cases past. Carefully, she drew out a single image. Eleanor's face, caught in a moment of laughter, eyes alive with the secrets of youth. There was something in those eyes, a question, a sadness, a promise. Miss Marple placed the photo beside her diary, the two now joined by time and by purpose. A hush fell over the cottage. In the stillness, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty, an understanding that went beyond facts and evidence. This was the moment when the frame of the picture came together, the separate details suddenly forming a whole. It was a feeling she had known before, that fragile hush before revelation. She closed the last page of her diary and murmured, almost to herself, "Some secrets don't hide, they only wait for the right time." The words seemed to settle in the air, a promise and a warning both. The kettle whistled, and Miss Marple rose to make tea. Her hands were steady, her expression serene. In her eyes was the deep light of understanding, a conviction that the answers, so long shrouded in ash and silence, were finally ready to be found. Outside, the village slipped into darkness, unaware that the quiet woman in the small house at the end of the lane was, at last, on the brink of uncovering what St. Mary Mead most wished to forget. Some stories are not buried, they are simply waiting, patient as memory and persistent as the truth itself. Miss Marple poured her tea, sat in her favorite chair, and listened, not just for sounds, but for echoes. It was almost time. Chapter 8. The Unraveling Silence. Early morning brought a golden hush to St. Mary Mead, the kind of gentle stillness that carries a faint promise of healing. As the sunlight broke over the village, painting the vicarage windows with honeyed light, the gravity of what was to come drew people from their cottages and gardens. Word had gone out at Miss Marple's quiet request. Gather at the vicarage. There will be answers. Inside, the drawing-room felt almost ceremonial. The air shimmered with expectation and fear, and each face wore the tension of sleepless nights. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantelpiece, his presence reassuring, yet tense. Max sat in a corner, gaze lowered, hands nervously clenched together. Marlene hovered nearby, her face pale, her lips silently moving in prayer. Several villagers who had witnessed small pieces of the mystery stood together, casting wary glances toward the door. And finally, Ethan Renner arrived, shoulders squared, his smile as serene and impenetrable as marble. He entered the room like a man who owned it, settling into the only vacant armchair with deliberate calm. Miss Marple, quiet and dignified, rose from her place, gently closing her knitting bag. For a brief moment she surveyed the room, her blue eyes sharp yet kind. When she spoke, her voice carried the gentle authority of a judge about to pass sentence. "Mr. Renner, I just want to share a few things with you," she began. Ethan's smile never wavered. "Certainly, but as I've already said, I have nothing to do with any of this." Miss Marple nodded. She opened a page in her diary, holding it up not as a weapon, but as a record, witness to years of quiet watching. She spoke with the calm clarity that always made the truth feel inevitable. "Eleanor disappeared 3 years ago. Max's mother died of an overdose. Max returns from the retreat covered in blood. 2 boys still missing. And everywhere the same smell, the scent of clove and varnish cigarettes." A slight shift passed through the room. Ethan's composure faltered for a heartbeat, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but unyielding. "Drugs were hidden in the rehab storeroom. Neera's death was staged as a suicide, but 2 lipstick marks on the coffee mug, a cigarette burn on the curtain, and burnt diary pages all tell a different story." Inspector Craddock, never one to leap ahead of the facts, finally spoke. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting—" Miss Marple nodded, her gaze fixed on Ethan. "Ethan threatened Neera, hid Eleanor, killed Max's mother, and did it all for property and smuggling. He smuggled drugs using the missing people as human cargo, and when Neera was about to speak out, he silenced her too." A stunned silence fell. The truth hung between them, heavy, impossible, and yet suddenly heartbreakingly obvious. Ethan broke the stillness with a laugh, a sound brittle and echoing. "This is just clever storytelling. You have no proof against me." Miss Marple reached into her knitting bag and drew out a plain envelope. "This is a surviving page from Professor Neera's diary, the one you forgot to burn. And according to the forensic report, the fingerprints on it are yours." Craddock's eyes snapped to Ethan. For the first time, Ethan's face tightened with alarm. As Craddock signalled to the constables, Ethan jerked from his seat, making a desperate dash toward the door. The officers were faster. In seconds, Ethan was pinned, defiance draining from his features, replaced with something raw and frightened. The room erupted, voices raised, some in disbelief, others in outrage. Max's eyes filled with tears, and Marlene pressed her hands together in silent gratitude. But even then, Ethan was not cowed. He looked straight at Miss Marple, voice harsh with wounded pride. "I wasn't alone. The people who took orders from me, they were all involved. Do you really think it was just me?" "You still only know half the truth, Marple." Miss Marple regarded him with a calm, both pitying and resolute. "Perhaps, but sometimes even half the truth outweighs someone else's entire lie." Craddock nodded to his men, and they led Ethan away, his protests fading down the corridor. A thick silence followed, one filled with the clock's measured ticking and the slow release of collective breath. Miss Marple quietly closed her diary, tucking it and the envelope safely away. She retrieved her knitting with slow, deliberate care. Then she said, more to herself than to the room, "Secrets never shout. They reveal themselves when the time is right." It was over. The room slowly emptied, leaving only the echo of what had transpired, and the thin, uncertain hope that comes after a storm. The next day, sunlight returned to St. Mary Mead. The village exhaled, its burdens, though never forgotten, suddenly lighter. Joy arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, her steps hesitant but determined. She found the old lady in her garden tending to her beloved flowers. Joy recounted the ordeal to her friend, voice trembling. "Even now, my soul shakes remembering the day Max appeared in front of my car. I keep thinking if I'd done just one thing differently." Miss Marple smiled gently, setting aside her trowel. "It was no small thing, my dear. What you saw and what you did helped bring the truth into the light." Joy's eyes glistened with relief, though her smile was wistful. She asked permission to leave, to visit relatives for a while, and escape the lingering shadows of the past. Miss Marple nodded, but held up a finger. "First promise me," she said, "that after you leave here, the very first thing you'll do is get your driver's license." Joy laughed, tears breaking at the corners of her eyes. "Of course, that's a promise. After all this, it seems absolutely essential now." She got into her car and drove off, waving through the open window, sunlight glinting in her hair. Miss Marple watched her go, then turned her attention back to her garden. The roses were in bloom again, radiant with new color. The lavender scented the air, and somewhere a lark was singing. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple allowed herself a rare moment of contentment. She had seen evil at work, had traced its path through the gentle lanes and hedgerows of her village, but she had also seen courage, loyalty, and hope prevail. She knew there would always be secrets, always new puzzles waiting for her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom. But for now, the peace of St. Mary Mead was restored, and that was enough. She bent to her flowers, her hands steady, her heart at rest, the gentle click of her knitting needles the only sound in the still, forgiving morning.